If your anxiety, stress, distress continues to come back, no matter how hard you pray or you try to think positive or just calm down, listen, it's not because you're broken, but rather it's because something in you is still open. What I mean is that anxiety, our stress response, the distress that we feel in a given moment, it's not random. It is rather the result of loops that are open and that were never closed after something truly painful or overwhelming or confusing happened to us. Now, those loops that were opened, they're supposed to be opened. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But what happens is when we never close these, then we continue to repeat the same responses, sometimes for hours and sometimes for decades. And so, in the next few minutes, I want to give you a simple map with easy takeaways in order to take back control of that stress response, that anxiety, that distress. And we're going to do so by closing 3 specific loops that your painful experiences left open. Now, here's the challenge that I see a lot of people fall into is that what we have been taught doesn't quite work. Now, there's a half truth or a bit of truth in everything that I'm going to say, but I'll tell you why it doesn't work for the outcomes that we want often. So we'll try things like, well, just control your thoughts. And yes, it's true. Mindset is so important. Or we'll try things like, well, just calm your body. But I know people that have done so many breathing exercises, they almost, in moments of stress or distress, have breathed so heavily or so much that they almost go into a hyperventilation. We're taught things like just trust God more. And yes, that's true, but it's almost like being told, well, just be happier. Just be happier. Can't you do it? It's not a coping mechanism so much as it is a cultivation of something that is much longer term. Or we've been taught, hey, just talk it out once and move on. Come on. Why are you getting stuck in the same thing? In fact, maybe a loved one has told you that before. So any one of these tips or tricks that we've been taught, they have an element of truth in them, but if they're just used by themselves or haphazardly or randomly, they always fall short because they target symptoms. The physical is a symptom. The mindset, the thought is a symptom. Even trusting God, it is a symptom. In other words, it's treating anxiety as something that's purely mental or purely physical or purely spiritual, or when people tell you just to talk it out once and move on, it's purely something to suppress. And so what happens is we can come to these conclusions when we don't see the result in our level of anxiety or stress or distress that we want to. I mean, we can start to think, hey, if I still feel this, then I must be doing something wrong. Or we can start to think, well, wait a second, I should be over this by now, shouldn't I? We can even start to think that, hey, this is just part of who I am. Or if I open this up, man, it's just going to overwhelm me again. But here's what I want you to know, and it's that anxiety isn't the problem, it's the signal. As I alluded to before, anxiety opens a loop when something is overwhelming or confusing, or we don't have all the answers, or is just more than we can handle. It opens a loop. And that is a good thing because anxiety is an activating energy. And a lot of times it moves us to problem solve, to ask questions, to even take actions that create a better reality. However, when the loop stays open, that's when it can cause problems and get in the way of our functioning. Anxiety exists to open a loop, but then to be closed. When your alarm goes off in the morning and you feel that stress response, that anxiety, it opens a loop, but then you turn off the alarm or you get dressed, you move into action, you prepare your breakfast, you get out the door, you move toward having a productive and a constructive and a day that makes you feel proud. Well, you've closed the loop. That is how it's supposed to work. That is how we are created. But when it stays open, well, then something is unsettled. And so anxiety, not as a problem, but as a signal, is pointing to something, something that your mind or your body or even relationships never got to finish, never got to resolve, never got to integrate into your story. So instead of asking, how do I get rid of anxiety? The better question that I want you to start to ask today is, what loop is still open? And on the other side of these three loops that we're going to get to see together, you'll have clear action steps to how to close the loop. So the first loop that gets opened that we want to close in order to resolve our anxiety and use it as a productive force that it is the cognitive loop. You see, your brain is still trying to make sense of what happened when that loop stays open. And what keeps it open is this idea of confusion or misinterpretation, or sometimes even false beliefs that are formed in our pain. False beliefs about ourselves, false beliefs about others, false beliefs about how the world works and operates. And this sounds like, well, what happened was my fault, or I'm not safe. The world is a cruel place. I can't trust people. Or, and this is real, God let me down. And as long as we are unable or unwilling to make sense of what happened and at least have not all the answers, but some kind of understanding, paradigm about the world or about other people or our family system, then that cognitive loop is going to stay open and we are going to be plagued with this signal that is anxiety, the stress response that has not been resolved. And like I say, this can last for hours, this can last for decades. And so we really do want to close this loop and take back control. Here is how you begin to close it. First, you've got to name the story that you're telling yourself. This takes courage and it's not always easy, but it's paying attention to the patterns in your thinking. The story that you're telling yourself or about others or about the world in general, I want you to name that story. And then I want you to gently challenge and update that story with truth. Sometimes this is grounding through our physical senses, our perceptions in the real world. Sometimes this takes being very present and not telling ourselves a story about the person in front of us, but actually taking in the person in front of us and getting new information in order to change maybe the unhelpful or untrue story about this person that we had locked in a box for so long. This requires that we gently challenge and update that story and really anchor it to truth so that we're honoring and integrating both what actually happened, but also what it means now. We're not denying that something may be overwhelming or confusing or even painful happened that opened that anxiety loop, but we're also at the same time making sense of it now. See, your mind doesn't need perfection. It doesn't need all the loose ends tied up, but what it does need is clarity. What it does need is connection. The clarity that what happened, happened, and yet now we're in a different set of circumstances. So that's the cognitive loop. Here's the second loop that anxiety opens and that we need to close, and it's the physical loop. And this is when our body is still carrying an unfinished stress response. Again, stress responses are good. Anxiety is an activating energy. However, when it stays open, when we have chronic stress or we've just never closed the loop, that's when it really gets in the way of life and actually can do damage, not just in our relationships and in some of our ambitions and goals and follow through, but even in our physical health. And so what keeps this anxiety loop open is when we default to a fight or a flight or a freeze, or we can go the other way, fawn or fold. All five of those are trauma responses that has never gotten resolved. In other words, our bodies still perceive threat or danger even when the threat or the danger has passed. And of course, this leads to chronic tension. It can lead to hypervigilance when we're perceiving threat, even when it's not there, right? And of course, that can lead to breakdown in relationships when people are like, whoa, like Why did you take it that way? I've seen this in my own life. I've seen this in the life of many people that I've gotten to work with. Or it can go the other way and lead to shutdown, where we pull away from people or even from certain risks and goals in life because, well, we perceive it to be just too scary. Can I tell you something though? While we want to do the cognitive work, which we talked about in the loop one, you can't think your way out of what your body is still holding. In other words, to close this loop, it requires a physical response. And so the way that we begin to do this is by increasing awareness of what's going on in our body. If you're not aware of what's going on in you, it's just driving your day. What we want to do is we want to pay attention to what's going on, and we want to give our body what it needs. Now, it's not your leader. You get to lead it. Your body, you get to be in control of. And it requires paying attention, and it requires responding to what it needs. So when it feels like it is in danger, what you want to do is you want to ground and recognize, wait a second, I am safe now. Of course, if you're in danger, leave the situation or do what you can, right? But if it's misinterpreting danger, our way out is through grounding and bringing our attention into the here and now. We can do this through one of our senses or through all five of our senses. In fact, one way to do this, and you may have done this at a certain point in your life, but one way to start is using your eyeballs and saying, what do I see right now? And really look and really see the light, the shadows, the contours on someone's face that you're sitting across from in a coffee shop or in your kitchen. To really take in how many different shades of green are there on that tree right now. We're hyper focusing on the present, because through our body, we are reminding ourselves, hey, we're safe now. The danger has passed. And what we're doing is retraining that open loop to now close. Our body can recognize safety rather than threat, can recognize resolution rather than danger, okay? Your body isn't the enemy, but it does need to finish what it started. Remember that stress response is a good thing. It's a gift from our creator, but it's not meant to take control of our lives. So we've got the cognitive loop, we've got the physical loop. And the third and final loop that we want to close in order to take back control of our anxiety is the relational loop. This is when something relational was left unresolved, unspoken, unsupported, and ultimately you, to some degree, in some way, felt unsafe. And so what keeps it open in our lives is when we pull back in isolation, is when we don't have safe relationships where we can safely process. That's, yes, physical safety, but more about emotional safety, where you can actually bring your full self and safely process thoughts and feelings. What keeps this loop open also is where we don't have repair when things go wrong, where there's no validation, where we're actually feeling something strong, where there's no witness or a holding space that someone else opens to us. Now, you can find this professionally, but I also want you to cultivate this in your friendships. And until we do, some of the common outcomes are thinking, I'm alone in this. There's no one else in the world who could understand what I'm going through. Or we think, I have to carry this myself. Why would I even burden someone else with this that's going on inside of me? And yet, as long as we do that, we're keeping the relational loop open. And so here's what we need to do in order to begin closing that loop and coming back into full functioning without anxiety running our life. We need to cultivate safe and honest connection. Now, this isn't just venting with somebody in your small group or a neighbor or another parent at a soccer practice. This is actual connection. This is a back and forth. This is where someone sees you and cares enough about you to say, wow, that sounds really painful. There's validation. There is a seeing you. There's taking you seriously. And where there is a breakdown in a relationship, this is also having relationships where there is repair. and seeking that repair and recovering that relationship, re-establishing that emotional connection, which again isn't easy, but it absolutely is possible. It's a skill that we build, and it's so important for the sake of not leaving the loop open, but closing the loop. And by the way, let me say this. Sometimes repair is not possible either because the person is unwilling or because it is unsafe to approach that person, like literally, physically, not good for our well being, or because the person has passed. And if that's the case, one of the ways that we close the relational loop is by actually grieving what we cannot repair, what is unable to be repaired. It's important to grieve. It's actually healing to grieve. And let me say this to those of you with a strong faith background. This can also mean re engaging with God relationally, emotionally, not just intellectually as you read or recite some prayer, but actually engaging in a relationship with Him. That can begin to close the loop. You've heard me say this before, but it's true that healing never happens in isolation. Healing happens in connection. Now, what I've seen is that most people try to fix their stress response, their distress, their anxiety in just one of these areas, or with a little here, a little tip and trick there, some short form content here with some hack. And what happens is that the loops stay open. Even if you do close one or two of the loops, as long as one of these loops stays open, then your mind, your body, your spirit are not going to resolve and integrate and close that stress response. So you now have a map. You now have clarity about what needs to be closed. Here's your next step, especially if this resonated, if this helped you see your anxiety differently. I want you to know that this is just the beginning. To actually close these loops often takes time, and it often takes guidance and support. So if you want to go deeper, if you want to start applying this in your own life, I want you to go to peacestartstoday.com. There you will find a short training, really helpful resources to begin closing these loops, to begin taking back God-given agency over your life, and to be emotionally free and fully alive. That's what I want for you, and that's what is possible. You don't have to wait until anxiety forces your attention. Rather, you get to address what's underneath now. So, God bless you. We'll see you at peacestartstoday.com, and we'll talk soon, friend.